Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam with Historic Travels, and as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subscribers and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it. And if you would like to take a couple extra steps to help support the Historic Travels YouTube channel a little bit more, there is a Patreon for this channel. There's a link for that in the description. Thank you guys, that's awesome. And alright guys, so now we are going into part 2 of the story of the sinking of the Titanic. Now if you have not watched part 1, I highly encourage you to go back and do that before you start this video, because this video is going to take off right where part 1 left off, so I'm not going to go back and re-explain things. I'm going to be making this video under the assumption that you've already seen part 1. So please, if you have not watched that video yet, there's a link for it in the description. Go watch that video, then resume this one. Alright guys, well hey, without any further ado, let's get into today's topic.
When we last left the Titanic, it was approximately 12:40 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1912. At this time period, the first lifeboat was preparing to be successfully lowered away from the RMS Titanic. This lifeboat, which had a capacity for 65 people, would unfortunately only have 28 souls on board when it left the Titanic.
So why was this the case? Why was it that in the beginning parts of the sinking, so few people were on board the initial lifeboats launched from the Titanic? Well, there were a lot of reasons for this, but number one was it had to do with the passengers didn't really even know what was going on. Shoot, some of the officers didn't even know what was going on at this point. Anyway, so most of the passengers on board the Titanic that had found their way up to the deck still believed that this was a drill. They didn't believe that the Titanic was actually sinking. And you might be wondering, how would they not know the ship is sinking? I mean, didn't they notice that the Titanic was really heavily listing by the bow, like the bow was lower in the water? Well, I'm sure some of them did notice, but that's what's funny about our minds. You get used to it very quick. So even if they did notice it at first, after some time, your body naturally adjusts. So the Titanic wasn't so far gone yet that people were actually alarmed. And on top of that, the crew is telling the passengers, it's just a drill, you'll be back on board for breakfast, and if anybody has ever been on a ship at night and you look out at the ocean looks freaky at night. I mean, it's just pitch black as far as the eye can see. No light, it's freezing cold. And on top of that, they're telling the women and children to get in this boat and leave your husbands behind, and it's just a drill. I mean, would you feel safe doing that? Why would you want to get into a rowboat in the middle of the North Atlantic on a freezing cold night when you've got this brilliantly lit, very warm, and nice Titanic just sitting there? I mean, I understand why so few people were hesitant to get into a lifeboat in the early stages of the sinking due to the fact that they didn't really even know what was going on.
This chart, which was taken from the amazing Titanic book On a Sea of Glass, shows the timestamps at which each lifeboat was actually able to leave the Titanic from the port side and the starboard side. So even though the crew did have some issues getting the lifeboats launched and filled up in the initial parts of the sinking, as you can see from this chart, they were quite efficient at getting the lifeboats away from the Titanic pretty efficiently, with about 2 lifeboats leaving the Titanic every 5 minutes or so. And of course, as the sinking progressed and people actually realized what was going on, these lifeboats would leave with a lot more people on them than it was in the initial parts of the sinking. Most of the issues with the crew and dealing with the lifeboats seems to have occurred during the early stages of the sinking, while people were still trying to figure out the scope of what was happening to the Titanic.
Now, just a quick disclaimer about this video. This video is not going to be an in-depth look at the launching of the Titanic's lifeboats. From 1240 up to the sinking, the lifeboats launch at such a rapid rate that I don't have time to actually go through and analyze each lifeboat launch and talk about a lot of the interesting information that can go along with them. And trust me, some of these lifeboats are very interesting. Right now, for this video, we're just going to be talking about the Titanic itself, the events around the sinking. And then I will make a dedicated video talking about the launching of the lifeboats and some key events that happen with those at another point.
We are coming up on 12:45 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and at this point 2 things happen. Number 1, the second lifeboat to leave the Titanic is successfully launched with 36 people on board, and number 2, the DDeck gangway door on the port side of the Titanic is opened up. Now, a gangway door is essentially used to actually load passengers onto a ship while a ship is at port, and Second Officer Charles Lightoller sends some men down to open this door, with the whole idea being to use them as another means to load passengers into the lifeboats. So essentially, you'd open the door, the lifeboat would roll up to the door, you'd load passengers through it, etc., etc. However, this door was completely forgotten about throughout the course of the sinking, and it allowed a new way for the water to actually rapidly flood the Titanic once the Titanic sank to the point that water could actually reach this DDeck gangway door.
Now, in case you're wondering how it's possible that Lightoller could actually forget about this DDeck gangway door, let me give you the backstory so you'll understand the situation a little bit more. Essentially, what happened is Second Officer Charles Lightoller ordered a man to go down and open up that door for the reasons I said earlier, and then to report back to him once this task had been done. And Lightoller never saw the man again. Throughout the course of the evening, Lightoller never talked to this man to confirm whether or not the door had been opened or not. And he didn't even know if the door had been opened. There was a lot of debate among the Titanic community as to whether or not this door was in fact open that night. Now, here's where the evidence comes in that the door was most likely opened, as Lightoller said. When we went down to the wreck of the Titanic, the DDeck gangway door is still open and visible on the wreck to this day. Now, skeptics of this would probably say, oh, the door got blown open when the Titanic slammed into the seafloor. And sure, possible. But when you take into account all the information that Lightoller said, plus some key evidence that occurred as the Titanic continued to sink, if you want my opinion, I say it's about a 99% certainty that this DDeck gangway door was in fact open, like Second Officer Charles Lightoller said.
At 12:47 a.m., the RMS Titanic fires off its first distress rocket in an attempt to signal the mystery ship that is on the horizon. Now, as stated in part 1 of this series, about 20 minutes before this, a mysterious vessel was spotted roughly 10 miles or so away from the RMS Titanic. Now, this ship wasn't responding to the Titanic's distress calls over the Marconi wireless system, and it also wasn't responding to the Morse lamp. So at this point, the officers on board the Titanic were hoping that the distress rockets would be a way to get this vessel, or this mystery vessel's, attention and get them over to help rescue the people on the Titanic.
Now, there have been a lot of theories over the decades as to what the identity of this mystery vessel actually was. Some people believe it was a ship called the Mount Temple, which was around 50 miles or so away from the Titanic. Now, I don't think that was possible because at 50 miles, you wouldn't be able to see anything at that point. I'm under the impression that it was the steamship Californian. Now, a lot of people like to argue this case, but I'm about to show you some key evidence as to why I actually believe the Californian is the mystery ship that the Titanic was seeing that night.
The vessel seen in this picture is the rumored mystery ship that was visible on board the RMS Titanic the night she sank, the SS Californian. Now, why do I personally believe that this vessel was the mystery ship that was spotted on the Titanic that night? Well, it has to do with mostly evidence that was given out during the inquiries after the Titanic disaster. You see, the crew that were on board the Californian that night reported seeing a ship come up alongside them at around 11:40 p.m., and then mysteriously this vessel seemed to just stop. Now, that timestamp right there is proof to me because it coincides with the exact time that the RMS Titanic struck the iceberg. So the people on the Californian saw a ship pull up. At 11:40, this ship seemed to stop. That matches exactly with what happened on board the RMS Titanic after she struck the iceberg.
Now, before everybody in the comment section goes, wait a minute, if they said they saw a ship stop at 11:40, sure, that matches up with the Titanic, but we all know now that the Titanic actually continued on under her own power for a few minutes after the iceberg impact. Doesn't that counteract what they said they saw in the Californian? Well, most likely not, because the Titanic did not continue on under her own steam for that long post-iceberg impact, only around 5 or 10 minutes or so. And besides that, she wasn't even traveling that fast. So if there were any discrepancies in the location of the Titanic based on the views that the people had on the Californian, at being 10 miles away, it's highly unlikely that they would have noticed any noticeable progression of the ship in that short amount of time post-iceberg impact.
The second key piece of evidence that really makes me believe that the mystery ship seen that night by the Californian was the Titanic has to do with the fact that the crew on the Californian said that about an hour or so after observing this mystery vessel, the mystery ship started shooting off rockets. Now, at the time, the crew on the Californian was kind of confused as to what these rockets actually meant. But here are the two key things to take away from here. Number one, the crew on the Californian saw a ship pull up and stop around 11:40 p.m. Matches what happened with the Titanic exactly. Number two, about an hour or so after this ship stopped, the crew on the Californian said that they saw this mystery ship shooting off rockets. Again, that matches with what happened on the Titanic exactly. So in my opinion, this mystery vessel was the Californian that was seen by the Titanic the night she sank.
Now, even though we've established that it was most likely the Californian that was seen by the Titanic the night she went down, I don't blame the crew on board the Californian for being confused at what they were observing when they were watching the Titanic from so far away. And there's three key pieces of evidence to completely understand the picture between what was going on with the Titanic and the Californian the night she sank. Number one, the Californian did not answer the Titanic's distress call because the Marconi operator on board the Californian was asleep. They only had one operator on board the Californian who actually really knew what he was doing and could respond to distress calls, and he had already gone to bed for the night, so the Californian couldn't hear the Titanic. Number two, the crew on the Californian did attempt to contact the Titanic by using a Morse lamp, just like what the Titanic tried to do to the Californian. However, due to the weird atmospheric conditions that night, it caused the light of the Morse lamp to be obscured. So the crew on both ships thought they were seeing the dots and dashes of Morse code. They weren't really sure. So they thought maybe it was just a flickering mast light. Like they didn't really know what was going on due to the weird weather effects that night. And number three, when the Titanic was shooting off rockets, they were not shooting off rockets correctly based on what the law said you do to fire rockets for distress at sea. You see, rockets could also mean company signals, which is what the Californian crew thought they were seeing when the Titanic started shooting off rockets. In order for a rocket to be launched at sea and have it mean distress, you have to shoot off rockets in 1-minute intervals. Now, in the case of Titanic, it was shooting off rockets in 5-minute intervals. So I really don't blame the crew of the Californian for being confused at what they were observing the night the Titanic went down.
Now, the crew on board the Californian had been reporting to their captain about the exchanges between this mystery ship that they were observing. Now, the captain of the Californian had actually went to bed not long after they began observing this mystery ship on the horizon. Now, the crew on the Californian were sending updates to the captain as to the behavior of this mystery ship, including the fact that the ship had stopped, this ship was shooting off rockets, but the captain of the Californian basically thought what I just said. He thought the rockets were company signals. So he told the crew of the Californian to try to contact this mystery ship with the Morse lamp, which is what I was talking about earlier.
Now, here's my opinion on this whole situation with the Californian. I don't give them as hard of a time as a lot of people do. You see, in my opinion, the crew of the Californian is only guilty of one thing. They didn't put the whole situation together. They didn't really understand what they were observing. It's not like the crew of the Californian said, oh, the Titanic is sinking and we're not going to help. No, it wasn't like that at all. The crew of the Californian just didn't know what they were looking at. But to me, if I would have been on the Californian that night and I would have seen a weird ship or like a ship acting weird on the horizon, you know, think about it. You have a ship, it's cruising along, it's getting close to an ice field, then it stops, and then you see it start shooting off rockets. Sure, they're inconsistent and they don't match what the maritime regulation is for distress, but still, it's shooting off rockets in the middle of the Atlantic. We think we see the behavior of a Morse lamp, we're not really sure. To me, that's enough of a reason to go wake up the wireless guy. You know, go wake up the wireless guy, go see what's going on. That is what I think the crew of the Californian is guilty of. They just didn't put the whole situation together, and they just didn't do enough the night that the RMS Titanic went down.
It is now 12:50 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1912, on board RMS Titanic, and the evacuation of this ship is well underway. Several lifeboats are already in the water, a good number of passengers are up on the boat deck, and the evacuation is starting to proceed rather smoothly despite the hiccups that the crew was facing earlier. However, deep inside the Titanic, this is a turning point in which the sinking begins to accelerate. You see, with the loss of Boiler Room 5 around 10 minutes before, this allows the water to rapidly start progressing through the Titanic without as much interference from the crew. Once the crew lost Boiler Room 5, this was a key turning point in the sinking of the RMS Titanic.
Even though Titanic was doomed with the loss of Boiler Room 6, Boiler Room 5 really did become the front line, so to speak, in the entire sinking of the RMS Titanic. That's where the crew tried to really mobilize, that's where they got together with their pumps, and their whole thinking was if they could hold back the water in Boiler Room 5 for as long as possible, then they could try to keep the water contained to the front sections of the ship, at least for a time. But when the crew lost Boiler Room 5 and they were forced to evacuate, the water pretty much had a free rein on the ship at that point. Sure, the crew would do things to actually delay the sinking a little bit more throughout the course of the evening, but Boiler Room 5 really was the front line for the crew on board the RMS Titanic that night. And when they had to evacuate that room, that really did signal the end for the RMS Titanic. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. And yeah, before you guys go, I do have one last thing I'd like to say. When I was making this video, my whole plan was to cover the next hour of the sinking. go from 12:40 a.m. to 1:40 a.m. Not just go from 12:40 a.m. to 12:50 a.m. But you know, whenever you start talking about the Titanic, there's so many little details you have to cover and really explain for you to get the complete picture as to what happened on this ship that night. If you sugarcoat certain details like the Californian, then you really don't get the clear picture as to what happened that night, and you start to draw the wrong conclusion. And that's not my goal for telling this story. I want to tell this story as accurately as possible and give all of you guys an above average understanding as to what happened that night. My goal with this series is to make all of you watching Titanic experts. So yeah, that's my goal for this series, and I thank you for taking this journey with me. Anyway guys, hey, thank you all so much for watching. We'll try to cover a little bit more time in the next video, and yeah, stay tuned for part 3 in the Titanic sinking series. All right everybody, well hey, you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good night everybody.